My friends, it's time to worry about Russia's winter offensive preparations. Historically, the Russians tend to have a poor start of the war. But eventually they learn and build up their forces. This winter, the front line might change a lot. Many major Ukrainian cities could fall to the enemy, and we might even get the grand return of Wagner. And now you can see the entire problematic for the Ukrainian command. What position will be prioritized? The Russians are putting pressure on Avdiivka. They will be increasingly pushing out of Bakhmut. And now the Russian command could even open a third front near Kupyansk. That's 3 positions that are threatened. And that's the entire strategy. Ukraine won't have enough reserves to defend all 3 of these cities at the same time. Even the mighty 47th Mechanized Brigade that fought in Robotine all summer long is now being redeployed to Avdiivka. This winter Russian offensive is so obvious that even the mighty UK Defense Intelligence picked up on it.
Yeah, baby!
They reported Russia has highly likely begun a coordinated offensive across multiple axes in the east of Ukraine. While the Ukrainian army is struggling to rebuild its forces lost in the summer, the fighting in Gaza rerouted a lot of equipment meant for Ukraine. Here from the New York Times, a Defense Department official said that tens of thousands of 105mm artillery shells promised to Ukraine would be diverted to Israel. Let's be honest, it's not looking good for Ukraine. On top of that, the US is also beefing up Israel's air defense by deploying 1 THAAD battery and at least 2 additional Patriot batteries, all of which could have been very useful to protect Ukrainian positions from Russian airstrikes. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to the channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads, so make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. First of all, we all know that to go on the offensive, you need a lot of troops. According to the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, between January and October 2023, 357,000 volunteers signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense. You heard me right, 357,000! That's huge! First of all, there are the former inmates of Shoigu's Storm Z assault detachments. Each one of these Storm Z detachments is composed of about 100 to 150 fighters, spread out across the front according to the army's needs. According to Mediazona's investigation, in 2023 alone, Russia's prison population decreased abnormally by 54,000. Obviously, we can assume that a lot of these prisoners signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Here we even have an exclusive short video about a Storm Z unit attached with veterans of the 200th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Northern Fleet, and they're now training all together. At the same time, Russia also released a lot of recruitment videos in the past few months, like this one calling for men looking for a greater purpose in life, or this one where Russian soldiers are discussing real estate and buying apartments in Kiev and Odessa. There are also multiple financial and social incentives for people to enlist. In the end, all this convinced a lot of civilians to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. In September, this Russian local newspaper reported that 1,073 people from the Vladimir region had been recruited between mid-April and September. And every 2 weeks or so, they would send another batch of recruits to the training ground. And we can also see that reports of Russian victories in the summer attracted way more recruits. So yeah, people from all over Russia responded to the call to arms. For example, in this video, you have the mayor of the infamous Vorkuta, who volunteered with the detachment of Komi natives as part of the Sibir Volunteer Cossack Brigade. In this picture, we can see a former general of the police force, who volunteered as an infantryman with the rank of lieutenant. Here, Andrei Demyentev, father of 6 children, who volunteered for the front as a senior BMP-3 mechanic. And there are many, many more. On the 5th of October, Defense Minister Shoigu visited some BARS units in the southern military district. BARS stands for Boevoi Armiyskiy Rezerv Specjalny, or Combat Army Reserve Special in English. There are currently up to 10,000 volunteers in BARS battalions numbered 1 to 20 scattered along the front. For example, according to Ukrainian deep state UA, there are 2 BARS in Luhansk and 4 in and around Robotine. That means we don't know the exact location of another 14 of those. By the way, the well-known bearded Cossack, Alexander Mojayev, better known as Cossack Babai, was reportedly KIA as part of one of these units on the Zaporozhye front. Although BARS battalions have been active since the early days of the Russian intervention, they're now being replaced by volunteer battalions. Yeah, it's the same thing, but with a different name. Gotta love Russian bureaucracy. Essentially, each Russian region is responsible to recruit, equip, and supply a certain number of battalions. This decentralized system proved to be very effective, as it bypassed all the bureaucratic and corruption problems of the Russian armed forces. And there are now at least 65 battalions of volunteers taking part in this SMO. For example, Bashkortostan formed 5 motorized rifle battalions, some of which are even using the latest T-90Ms. St. Petersburg also formed 5 of such battalions: Kronstadt, Neva, Pavlovsk, the tank battalion Aurora, and the Leningrad regiment, whose commander, Colonel Yevgeny Vashunin, was KIA during a counterattack on the 14th of July near Bakhmut. It was also reported that this 357,000 not only included volunteers, but also the ones that were part of the active reserves and that signed the contract. In my opinion, this is some bureaucratic gibberish for conscripts that enlisted in the Russian military after completing their mandatory military service. From a legal and technocratic perspective, these guys are considered as reservists. 400,000 Russian males go through military service every year. If 1 in 4 of them sign the contract, that's an additional 100,000. I know it's a rough overview, but essentially that's how the Russian military gained 350,000 men. And women, of course. And at this rate of 40,000 contracts per month, we can expect another 120,000 enlistments by the end of the year, for a total of 476,000 recruits in 2023. That's 500,000 new soldiers. That's a lot of people to just hold the line, if you ask me.
Oh, I know, that's because they have suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. I saw it on Reddit.
No. Even the 300,000 Russian reservists mobilized in fall 2022 were largely preserved. 4,000 of them were confirmed as KIA, plus an estimated 8,000 irrecoverable losses, aka wounded soldiers that won't return to the front. Theoretically, that means that 288,000 of them should still be able to fight. Like callsign Tobol, that was wounded in combat, but after recovery, he immediately reported back for duty. And here's callsign Biba. He entered the force as a Mobik, and he's now a deputy company commander of the 9th Brigade near Avdiivka. In the end, Ukraine might be facing a Russian Army 3.0 that is at least 750,000 strong. Russia is clearly preparing offensive operations. Now the question is when and where. Personally, I don't know when, but together we can look around as to where. Let's start in Avdiivka. We can fully expect Russian forces to continue putting pressure on the flanks of the Ukrainian Avdiivka grouping in an attempt to complete the encirclement of the city. According to the latest news, Russian soldiers of the 114th Brigade of the DPR stormed and captured the waste heap. And as you can see with these images, it completely overlooks the coke plant. This allowed Russian assault squads to secure the entire east side of the rail embankment north of Avdiivka. In my opinion, the next moves of the Russian command will be to get a foothold in Stepove and clear up the Ukrainian positions further north along the railway line. We could even see an attack towards Keramik and Novokalinyove in order to secure this wide flanking maneuver towards Berdishi. Meanwhile, in the south, the next logical step would be to push towards Sverne and Tonenke. And by October 26, the Russians also took control over the quarry north of Opitne, thus tightening even more the encirclement. However, like we've seen, it's not going to be that easy for the Russians. Ukrainians have many heavily entrenched positions all around Avdiivka, all linked up with each other with tunnels and concrete bunkers. In Russian military doctrine, heavy losses are tolerable as long as the objective is worth it. And we can be certain that for Russian generals, the high cost of this gamble is worth the heavy payoff. Another determining factor of this campaign will be the weather, and with the incoming now infamous Rasputitsa. With the main roads under scrutiny of Russian artillery, it will be harder and harder for Ukrainian reinforcements to get to the front with all the mud. Of course, this will also affect Russian logistics, although to a lesser extent. The adjacent proximity of the major urban centers of Donetsk and Makivka, with all their paved roads, will make this offensive much easier for the Russians than it is to defend for the Ukrainians. And this is perhaps why the Russians launched their offensive right before mud season. Now let's move a bit to the north towards Bakhmut, where the Russians are also preparing a surprise, especially since there are growing rumors of a Wagner comeback. According to the latest reports, the Wagnerians will be returning to the front under the rebranded DSHK, or Volunteer Storm Corps, while others will be part of the Russian Guard. For example, this famous T-80BV tank nicknamed Sibir, once used by the Wagner PMC on the streets of Rostov-on-Don, is now in service with the newly formed 116th Operational Brigade of the Russian Guard. This unit is currently undergoing training in Crimea and will also be composed of a new Cossack battalion called Tavrida. Truth be told, the situation is quite critical for the Russians near Bakhmut, and as of now, Ukrainian assault squads are regrouping south of the city. To add some context, here you can see the situation of the front line on August 1st. For a month, the Ukrainian 3rd Brigade Azov and the 5th Assault Brigade launched together strong attacks all along the Siversky Donetsk Canal and managed to capture this stronghold overlooking the village of Klishivka. 2 months and a half later, not only did they kick out the Russians from Klishivka, but they also secured the village of Avdiivka. Here you can see fighters of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade walking through the rubbles of Avdiivka. There's a funny story about Avdiivka. As you can see in this article, the Ukrainians claim to have destroyed the entire 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade in Avdiivka. But how is this possible? How can we actually take them seriously when we look at the actual size of the village? How can you hide 2,000 soldiers there? Clearly, this story is pure BS. Of course, these continuous Ukrainian attacks eventually paid off with a 2-kilometer gain, but they also came at a cost. The 5th Assault Brigade was pulled back and replaced with the Liut Assault Brigade of the police. Or what about this video, where you can see 3 destroyed or abandoned KTO Rosomak APCs and 5 destroyed or abandoned BMP-2s? Yes, by October 23rd, the Ukrainians managed to get a foothold on the other side of the rail embankment. But to do so, they also had to rotate out the elite 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, which we can assume suffered heavy losses. Now, to carry on the offensive, Ukraine brought forward the 22nd and 93rd Mechanized Brigade, as well as the 80th Air Assault Brigade. And these 3 brigades historically have been known more for their defensive posture than for any offensive operations. And this is not a coincidence, because this comes right at the moment where the Russians are restarting their own offensive actions. For a couple weeks now, the 106th Guards Airborne Division has been increasingly active north of Bakhmut. On September 28th, Russian paratroopers pushed 2 kilometers towards Orikhovo-Vasiliivka and gained a foothold in the first houses of the settlement. On the same day, it was reported that some airborne troops supported by a former Wagner assault detachment entered the village of Vesely, located north of Solidar. But it seems that since then they have pulled back. And then on the 23rd of October, the Russians pushed towards Vasyukivka, with this video I showed you that was geolocated right here. By looking at all the axes of attack, it's obvious that the Russian troops in Bakhmut are trying to push along the MO3 highway in the direction of Slavyansk, while threatening the supply lines of the Ukrainian grouping in Siversk. But let's talk a minute about Kupyansk and the Luhansk front. The Russian army has at least 100,000 soldiers deployed there as part of the 1st Tank Army, and in late September, Ukrainian intelligence reported that the Russians were moving the 25th Army along the Kupyansk-Svatove line. On the 24th of October, the Washington Post reported, Russia presses counter-offensive in northeast Ukraine. Catastrophic! I couldn't hold myself. They actually wrote counter-offensive. Anyway, let's move on to the Kyiv Post. In this article, Syrskyi clearly explained to the newspaper that the main goal of the enemy is to defeat the Ukrainian troops with the encirclement of Kupyansk and a push up to the Oskol River. To me, this front looks like a reversed Kherson. Very similar configuration with a major city along the river and supply lines largely dependent on various river crossings. Hence the current Battle of the Bridges. As you can see on this map, in late September, the Russians damaged or destroyed 4 major bridges across the Oskol River with high-precision Kh-38 air-to-surface missiles launched from Su-34s. On the 29th of September, Russian artillery also destroyed this pontoon bridge. All these strikes make it so much harder for the Ukrainians to supply their troops on the other side of the river. However, the fact that the Oskol River is much more narrow than the Dnieper still allows the Ukrainians to repair the destroyed infrastructure more easily. However, what is it going to be like in a couple weeks of constant bombardments? Like we have seen, the Russian armed forces have concentrated a great deal of forces on the Kupyansk-Svatove axis. In response, the Ukrainian command immediately dispatched the elite Kraken battalion, the 32nd and 88th mechanized, as well as the 4th Tank Brigade in this sector. The problem now for Ukraine is that with this big army, the Russians can launch continuous assaults by Storm Z detachments to keep the Ukrainians on edge all along the front and to decrease their readiness. Having more troops allows you to make bolder moves since you can take in the losses. So if one day the Ukrainian defenders put down their guard, thinking it's just yet another Storm Z infiltration, boom! Within 24 hours, you'll have entire Russian armored brigades pouring through the breach and consolidating a breachhead. That's exactly what they've done on the Zherebiets River. And talking about this part of the front, the Russians still have their eyes on this very important ridgeline, which would open a gate for their armored formations to rush towards Borova. Right now, the Russians seems to increase activity around Avdiivka. In this video, you see a 7-man Russian infiltration squad that was geolocated right here. And a few days later, the Kraken battalion posted a video of a thwarted Russian mechanized infiltration, which was geolocated here. The goal of all this is to find a weak spot in the Ukrainian line of defense. And we can't forget that all this footage is only from Russian units that were detected. There are probably many more we don't know about. The Russian capture of Avdiivka could surround the Ukrainian forces in Kislivka and eventually bring Russian assault squads on the outskirts of Kupyansk. Equally as strategic in the sector is the village of Sinkivka. The Russians have tried to capture this settlement many times through frontal assaults and various maneuvers, but since then all of those have been repulsed. However, since this village controls the gate to Kupyansk, in mid-October, Russian infantry tried again to bypass the village through the forestry and apparently progressed 1.5 kilometers. And 1 week later, a Russian tank was destroyed here after a 1 kilometer push. The Russians could also exploit their current positions in Novoselivske. Honestly, there are many places along the Luhansk front where they could attack. As you can see, the Russian command is skillfully blurring the path of what they plan on doing. However, in my opinion, the most lethal Russian attack would be against Makivka. The village lies vulnerable in the valley. Storming the place won't necessarily be easy. We're talking about capturing a village, crossing a river, and capturing a high ground in this plateau. But the Russians could flank enemy positions from Novovodiane towards Petrivske, and this is where the entire southern front in Luhansk would collapse. All the Ukrainian troops here would be stuck. They would not be able to escape from the south because of this bottleneck, and essentially they would only have one exit and would be forced to withdraw or face encirclement. That would be phase 1 of the operation. Phase 2 could be to take the urban area of Zarishny and Torske into a pincer, with an attack both from the north and the east, and then bring the battle right to the gates of Liman, which the Russians have lost in October 2022. And if all this is successful and the Russians feel bold enough, they could even push towards Lozove. And this move would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Or like they say in Eastern Europe, steal 2 horses with 1 Cossack. Number 1, with the Russians positioned on the south, and with the bridges over the Oskol River regularly bombed, the positioning of the Ukrainian army on the east bank of the river will become very strenuous. Just like the Russians had to do with Kherson, there is the possibility that the Ukrainians would have to evacuate the east bank of the river and fall back on Kupyansk proper. Number 2, the attack along the Makivka-Torsk axis could be coupled with an attack from Bakhmut, which would take into a pincer the Ukrainian troops in Siversk. I know I've been talking about this maneuver for quite some time, but the threat is real, it's right there. If successful, this set of operations would lay the groundwork for an offensive against Slovyansk for summer 2024. Politically, this would complete the Russian conquest of Luhansk Oblast and allow them to focus their attention on Donetsk Oblast from the north, from the east, and from the south. Despite all the propaganda, of course, the Ukraine command is well aware of all this, and they're currently doing everything they can to avoid such nightmare scenario. On the 23rd of October, Ukraine regrouped battalions of the 72nd, 93rd Mechanized and 25th Air Assault Brigades to Izium. Currently, their equipment and vehicles are secretly located on the southwestern outskirts of Izium in some wooded area, and their personnel occupy private households abandoned by the locals. This would allow the Ukrainians to have some quick reaction force that could counterattack any Russian attempt against Lozove and Liman. And let me be clear, the Ukrainians have probably many more of such hidden reserves along the front line. Meanwhile, in the north, it was reported that the Ukrainians managed to repair the railway bridge in Kupyansk, and that they're constantly sending reinforcements to the forested area near Sinkivka in groups of 10 to 15 men. Overall, Ukraine has in reserve the 14th, 21st, 41st, 115th Mechanized Brigades, the Da Vinci Walls of the 67th Mechanized Brigade, as well as elements of the 13th Air Assault Brigade, all positioned on the second line, ready to make any Russian offensive extremely painful. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.